Hey dude. Yeah, people in the Middle Ages had junk food too. It just looked a lot weirder. Think fried cheese, meat pies filled with mystery scraps, and sweets made with rosewater, lard, and pepper. No forks, no hygiene, just greasy fingers and empty stomachs. Tonight we're stepping into those muddy market stalls, because behind all the kings and castles, regular folks were lining up for the medieval version of fast food, and it's way messier than you'd expect. If slow, strange history helps you sleep, hit like and subscribe. And drop a comment. Where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Now dim the lights, lay back, and let's head back to a world where deep fried meant danger, and dessert might still have feathers. You may not think much about porridge. In modern times, it's often a bland breakfast option, a soft, warm comfort food reserved for quiet mornings or the infirm. But porridge, boiled grains suspended in water or milk, was once the very backbone of survival. Across continents and empires, from the thatched huts of Anglo-Saxon England to the palaces of Song dynasty China, porridge quietly fueled armies, sustained the poor, and even served as a political tool. Its story doesn't begin with flavor or decadence, but necessity, and it goes back far further than many imagine. Roughly 10,000 years ago, humanity began a slow but unstoppable shift, from foragers to farmers. This transition wasn't glamorous. Early agriculture didn't offer variety, it offered survival. One of the first grains to be cultivated was barley, likely domesticated in the Fertile Crescent. Barley wasn't tasty in its raw form, nor easy to digest, but when boiled in water over low heat, it became soft, edible, and sustaining. It became porridge. In Mesopotamia, archaeological digs have uncovered ceramic bowls encrusted with a kind of cooked cereal residue. Clay tablets suggest early recipes, rudimentary instructions for mixing barley with water and sometimes honey or dates. This wasn't food for kings, it was food for everyone. Porridge didn't need an oven, just a fire, and a vessel that wouldn't shatter with heat. It democratized cooking, and in the cold of early mornings, or the hunger of winter evenings, it filled stomachs, slowly, completely. In ancient Egypt, a form of emmer wheat porridge was consumed daily. Roman soldiers were sustained by pulse, a thick, oat-like porridge, made from spelt and legumes. In ancient China, millet porridge, zhou, was often eaten plain for breakfast, though those with more means might add scallions or fermented soy. Throughout sub-Saharan Africa, thick porridges made from sorghum or millet remain staples to this day. In East Africa, ugali provides a foundation for meals, not unlike the gruels that kept medieval European peasants alive during lean seasons. Porridge was rarely a dish of prestige, but it was persistent. A meal that required minimal effort, could stretch thin harvests and adapt to regional grains. When famine loomed, and it often did in agrarian societies, governments, landlords, and monarchs paid close attention to grains. Grain storage and distribution became tools of statecraft. If bread was for the bakeries of the elite, porridge was the food of the people. It could be cooked in bulk. It could hide in plain sight. In 14th century England, records from manorial rolls reveal that workers were often paid in grain rations, which they took home to turn into porridge. This made lords both employers and primary food providers. Keeping the peasantry just fed enough, but never quite comfortable, was both economical and strategic. Even monasteries ran on porridge. Monks recorded not just prayers, but detailed grain stores. The Benedictine order's rulebook recommended 2 cooked meals a day. One was almost always some variation of boiled grain. Porridge was sustenance, but also control. In medieval hospitals, and even as late as the 19th century, gruel was considered ideal for invalids. Thin, watery porridge made from oats or barley was easy to digest, bland, gentle. But often that blandness was born not of concern but constraint. Hospital kitchens were not stocked like royal ones. Nurses, many of whom were nuns, boiled large cauldrons of oat gruel for dozens, sometimes hundreds of patients. Additions, honey, herbs, sometimes ale, were rare and saved for the very ill or very rich. You weren't supposed to enjoy gruel. You were supposed to survive it. Though often dismissed as tasteless, porridge evolved. In Scotland, where oats grow better than wheat, porridge became a cultural icon. Parritch, as it was called, was stirred with a wooden stick known as a spurtle and often left to set into a cake overnight, then sliced cold the next day. In parts of India, rice porridge, kanji, still carries spiritual significance. Served during festivals or periods of mourning, it symbolizes simplicity and humility, but flavor was rarely the point. Porridge was designed to be repeatable, reliable, a background to daily life. Imagine waking up in a smoke-darkened hut. Your feet touch the cold earth floor. There's no coffee, no sugar, no eggs sizzling, just a pot, perhaps still warm from the night before. You add water, scrape the bottom, stir slowly. The smell is faintly earthy, slightly sour. You eat in silence. Across centuries and continents, that quiet act remained unchanged. Long before granola, before breakfast cereal, and even before bread was widespread, there was porridge, a food not of luxury, but of survival. And yet, porridge wasn't always enough. What happened when grain supplies ran short? When fields flooded or frosted and the pots ran empty? What did people do then? When porridge became scarce, civilization itself trembled. Throughout history, societies were structured around the assumption of grain abundance. Fields, storage pits, granaries, and even taxes were oriented around keeping the grain porridge flowing. But grains are vulnerable, fragile in the face of frost, flood, rot, war, or plague. And when porridge failed, people had to adapt in desperation. This section explores what people did when the grain ran out. How substitution, scavenging, and political manipulation around porridge shaped everything from riots to revolutions. Medieval Europe was heavily dependent on seasonal rhythms. A late frost could destroy barley just weeks before harvest. An unexpected deluge might rot oats in the ground. During the Great Famine of 1315-1317, relentless rain destroyed harvests across much of Europe. For 2 years, fields turned to mud. Bread became scarce, and porridge became nearly unattainable. Monasteries attempted to distribute grain to the starving poor, but it wasn't enough. Manorial lords had no surplus. Many had already sold their stores. Markets collapsed. What little porridge could be made was stretched thinner and thinner. People began boiling acorns, bark, and ground up straw. In some areas of France and the Low Countries, famine led to rumors of cannibalism, not because porridge was gone, but because it had been the last line of defense. And without it, nothing stood between hunger and death. Desperation breeds invention. While grain was king, people experimented with anything they could boil into a porridge-like form. In Eastern Europe and Scandinavia, root vegetables like turnips and parsnips were mashed and mixed with flour to extend gruel. In parts of Ireland, nettle soup became a staple famine food. In parts of Africa during prolonged droughts, ground cassava, though toxic if improperly prepared, was converted into a thick paste, similar in role to millet porridge. The detoxification process was long and dangerous, but it turned a poisonous root into calories. Survival. In 18th century Russia, famine led to the creation of famine bread, made from ground bark and moss. But porridge could also take on strange ingredients. Descriptions exist of bran mash in English workhouses, where husks, dust, and spoiled grain were stirred together into an unpalatable but filling mush. These were not innovations born of creativity, but necessity. Porridge had to remain, even in degraded form. It was still better than nothing. Because of its central role in survival, grain, especially oats and barley, became a flashpoint for unrest. When prices rose or rumours of hoarding spread, people revolted. In 1775, the E8's flour war erupted in France. Angry over increased grain prices and bread shortages, mobs attacked bakeries and warehouses. But the real crisis was deeper. The government had relaxed price controls, leading to speculation. Grains were withheld, stored, sold abroad. And while bread was most visible, porridge, the daily fallback for the poor, was gone. The pattern repeated across centuries and continents. In Edo period Japan, rice shortages led to frequent uprisings. Though rice was used in ceremonies and as currency, commoners often relied on millet porridge for daily meals. When millet was diverted or rationed, outrage followed. In 19th century Ireland, the potato blight was catastrophic. But before the blight, oat porridge had already declined as a staple due to changes in land ownership and farming policy. With no grain and no potatoes, there was little left to boil. Starvation is silent at first. But when porridge disappears, voices rise. As the world industrialized, porridge followed. In the crowded slums of 19th century London and Manchester, thin oatmeal gruel became the defining food of the urban poor. Cheap, bland, and mass-produced in workhouses, it was more symbol than sustenance. Charles Dickens famously captured the despair of this diet. In Oliver Twist, the protagonist's plea, "Please, sir, I want some more," wasn't for flavour. It was a cry for more porridge, more fuel for life. In the United States, grits and cornmeal mush played similar roles. In post-Civil War Southern states, freed black families often relied on cornmeal boiled with water as their base food. Polenta in Italy, fufu in West Africa, pap in South Africa. Each culture had its own version of porridge, and each had stories of scarcity and substitution during times of strain. The irony was this: porridge was the food of the stable poor. When it vanished, chaos followed. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, governments began to realize something medieval lords had always known: control the porridge, and you control the people. Workhouses across Britain enforced gruel-based diets, not just for nutrition, but as discipline. Incarcerated individuals received a regulated portion of boiled grain, enough to survive, never enough to thrive. During World War I, rationing in Europe often emphasized oats and barley. In Germany, war gruel replaced bread. Propaganda encouraged citizens to embrace porridge patriotically. Boiled barley with roots and herbs was renamed Victory Gruel. In the Soviet Union, communal kitchens served kasha, a kind of buckwheat porridge, morning, noon, and night. And in Maoist China, rice porridge was symbolic of both solidarity and survival. Everyone ate the same gruel. Everyone was equally full or hungry. Porridge, then, was no longer just food. It was a tool of equality, compliance, and governance. Still, porridge was also quietly subverted. In Soviet gulags, prisoners shared crusts. or smuggled bits of dried fish into their porridge. In 1940s Britain, people flavoured government-issued oatmeal with stolen bits of jam, a spoonful of sweetness in a world of sameness. And in medieval times, some peasants, if they had chickens, would secretly crack an egg into their porridge, a luxury hidden in plain sight. Porridge absorbed rebellion quietly, not in fire or banners, but in flavour. But even as porridge adapted to crisis after crisis, it never disappeared. How did it manage to outlive empires, revolutions, and industrial upheaval? And what did it become? By the 20th century, porridge had survived famine, war, social upheaval, and empire. And yet, despite its durability, it began to fade from the central place it once held in daily life. Not because it failed, but because people forgot how much it once meant. As the modern world moved faster and food became industrialized, porridge slowly retreated from the center of the plate, but it never vanished. Instead, it changed form, sometimes quietly, sometimes in disguise. This section follows porridge into the present day, tracing its legacy in convenience foods, health movements, and memory, and asking what it means when the world forgets the foods that once made it possible. In the early 1900s, American food reformers, especially those associated with the Seventh-day Adventist movement, began pushing for plainer, more digestible breakfasts. Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, operating out of the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Michigan, saw heavy, morning meals as immoral and unhealthy. He believed that bland food reduced sinful urges and encouraged spiritual purity. Enter hot cereal. Oatmeal and wheat farina were marketed as modern versions of the old porridge, convenient, quick to prepare, easy to digest. Ads promised improved digestion and moral uprightness. Oats were no longer just the food of the rural poor or the ill. Now they were scientific, healthful, clean. Porridge had entered the modern breakfast table, but it did so under new branding. By mid-century, instant oats, cream of wheat, and other pre-packaged cereals had begun replacing slow-cooked gruels. The ritual of boiling grain for an hour faded. Microwaves and packets replaced fire and pot, but the comfort remained. In many cultures, porridge never entirely disappeared. It simply transformed into a cultural relic. Scottish parritch, once a daily staple, became something served with whiskey. Cream on Burns Night. Grits in the American South became tied to identity and heritage. Kasha, once the foundation of Eastern European meals, now appeared on Jewish holiday tables. Porridge went from food of necessity to food of memory. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, thick sorghum or maize porridge is still eaten daily. Ugali, sadza, and sima. But increasingly, rice and bread are seen as aspirational replacements. The grain hierarchy reversed. What was once a fallback is now viewed by some as a sign of poverty. In Scandinavian countries, rye or barley porridge is often served. In schools or hospitals, still practical, but also deeply cultural, something that belongs to the past, even when it remains in the present. Ironically, in the 21st century, as industrial food boomed, porridge made a comeback, rebranded once again, this time as ancient, wholesome, and artisanal. Overnight oats, quinoa bowls, and steel-cut groats began appearing on health blogs and brunch menus. The slow foods movement embraced porridges of every kind. In upscale cafes, oat bowls with chia seeds and almond butter sold for $10. What had once been the food of medieval peasants was now a fashionable lifestyle choice. Food marketers called it returning to roots, but it was also a kind of selective forgetting. The slow boil of porridge meant centuries of hardship, scarcity, survival. That memory was not included in the packaging. Still, whenever the world shakes, porridge returns. During the COVID-19 pandemic, global demand for oats, rice, and barley spiked. People hoarded shelf-stable grains. Recipes for quarantine porridge appeared online. In a moment of uncertainty, humanity once again turned to the thing that had always filled the pot, slowly and surely. In refugee camps, aid organizations continue to distribute high-calorie grain-based porridges. In war zones and disaster areas, large vats of hot cereal still feed crowds when nothing else can. Cheap, safe, nourishing. And in homes across the world, parents continue to prepare morning bowls for children, because some things don't need to change. Porridge is not flashy. It doesn't photograph well. It doesn't star in royal banquets or blockbuster films. But it teaches something essential about history. It reminds us that survival is not always dramatic. That most of human history was lived not in revolutions or battles, but in kitchens and fields and quiet hunger. That resilience often comes not from heroic action, but from waking up one more day, boiling the pot again, eating what little there is, and going on. It shows us that history is not only shaped by kings and conquerors, but by mothers stirring, pots, monks recording stores, children scraping bowls, and workers lining up for gruel. And that in the end, civilizations may rise and fall, but they all, at one point, relied on porridge. As you finish this story and reflect on its quiet endurance, consider, what else have we forgotten that once fed the world? And what might we rediscover, not just in food, but in the forgotten rhythms of daily life? You might imagine the medieval world as a place of rustic feasts or meagre rations, whole roast pigs in castles or dry bread in cottages. But the reality of daily food consumption was often far more ordinary, and surprisingly, it included snacks. Yes, snacks. Munchable, greasy, grab-it-and-go food. From the streets of London to the alleyways of Cairo, medieval people craved the same thing you might while wandering a modern market. Something hot, cheap, and fast. And while they didn't call it junk food, that's exactly what it was. By the 13th century, towns across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia had grown bustling and populous. Urbanization meant fewer people growing their own food and more relying on markets for daily sustenance. Permanent marketplaces existed in towns from Bruges to Baghdad. Stalls were often clustered by trade. Fishmongers in one corner, bakers in another, cooks in another still. And among them, a particular figure became ubiquitous, the street vendor. These men and women prepared small, hot foods to be eaten on the go, especially by those who couldn't afford full meals or had no access to kitchens. Most urban dwellers didn't cook much at home. Firewood was expensive and housing was cramped, so people bought snacks, often fried or baked, cheap, filling, and not always healthy. Let's take a stroll through a typical 13th century English town market. The smells alone would be overwhelming. Wood smoke, roasting meat, fermenting ale, and the sharp tang of salted fish. From the cook's stall, a man in a grease-stained tunic serves up meat pies. These were not the flaky delights of modern bakeries. The crust or coffin was often inedible, designed more to hold the filling than to be consumed. Inside, bits of beef, mutton, or pork, seasoned with onions, pepper, and sometimes vinegar. Further along, a woman sells fritters, vegetables or apples dipped in batter and fried in lard. Sweet and savoury fritters were common, sometimes dusted with sugar if you could afford it. These were among the few affordable sweets on offer. Then there's cheese curds, sold wrapped in linen or on wooden skewers. Children sucked on them like candy. Some stalls offered roasted chickpeas, still common in Mediterranean regions. You might find pottage ladled out in thick scoops, a cross between a soup and a stew. Sometimes it was meat-based, but often just grains and root vegetables. It wasn't exactly portable, but if you had a bowl or a chunk of stale bread, it was doable. And yes, even sausages existed, coiled, spicy, and often cooked right on the street. The term junk food implies indulgence, but in the medieval world, it could also be dangerous. Without refrigeration, meats spoiled quickly. Vendors disguised off flavors with heavy spices or vinegar. Food poisoning was a constant risk. The medieval cook might serve your fried eel with a side of intestinal distress. In response, many towns attempted to regulate street food. The assize of bread and ale, passed in England in 1267, set standards for the size and price of loaves and tried to ensure bakers weren't cheating customers. London city authorities routinely fined street cooks for serving unfit meat, using rancid fat, or selling in unsanctioned areas. But enforcement was difficult. The food was cheap. People needed it. And many couldn't afford better. So, despite the risks, the demand remained high. Not just the poor. Students, travelers, apprentices, dock workers, monks, even knights stopping briefly in town, all were known to frequent cookshops. The modern equivalent might be the office worker buying chips from a vending machine, or the college student grabbing fast food between classes. Chroniclers of the time often sneered at snack vendors and their clientele. One 14th century English writer called fried pastries indecent trifles sold to idle mouths. But the fact that he wrote about them at all reveals how embedded they were in daily life. Even pilgrims, journeying across Europe to Santiago or Canterbury, relied on roadside food carts, boiled beans, spiced wine, dried fruits, all designed to be eaten quickly and without ceremony. Meanwhile, in cities like Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus, street food was even more sophisticated. Arab cookbooks from the 10th and 11th centuries list dozens of recipes for portable meals. Vendors sold sambusak, early samosas, stuffed dates, fried eggplant slices and lamb skewers. Spiced chickpeas, rice cakes and sweet fritters were popular among the working class. Coffee had not yet arrived, but sellers of spiced milk and honeyed water offered pick-me-ups for tired feet. Unlike in Europe, many of these vendors were respected. Food guilds monitored hygiene and pricing. The muhtasib, a kind of market inspector, oversaw food quality and punished fraudulent cooks. Yet, even here, the food was still indulgent, tasty, addictive, often deep-fried. In 13th century China, especially during the Song dynasty, cities like Hangzhou had vibrant street food scenes. Steamed buns, sticky rice balls, and noodle soups were sold from carts. Fried tofu, pickled vegetables, and small meat skewers filled the air with spice and smoke. Marco Polo famously described street foods during his travels through Asia. His accounts suggest amazement at the variety and availability of cheap eats. Just like today, people in the Song dynasty were busy, social, and hungry. Street food fed that need. Medieval snack carts didn't have jingles, but they had their own way of grabbing attention. Vendors shouted their offerings, hot pies, or rang small bells. In France, cheese sellers sang rhymes. In Italy, fritter merchants called out with a kind of chant, drawing customers through voice alone. Food historians refer to this as the acoustic ecology of the medieval market, the way cities sounded as well as smelled. And for many, those sounds were tied to comfort, hunger, and daily rhythm. But as towns grew larger and authorities grew stricter, how long could the street vendor thrive? Could junk food survive regulation, reform, and the moral crusades that swept through the medieval world? As the 13th century gave way to the 14th and 15th, the aroma of frying fat and spiced pies still wafted through medieval marketplaces. But the future of street food was becoming more precarious. Why? Because authorities, both civic and religious, began to see street food vendors as a problem, a health risk, a moral danger, a challenge to order and purity. Yet these vendors endured, adapting to each new crackdown, inventing new dishes, and defying the perception that the food of the streets was low and unworthy. This section explores how junk food collided with power, purity, and the politics of hunger. By the later Middle Ages, the Church had grown increasingly concerned with the state of the soul and what went into the body. Fasting was heavily promoted. The sin of gluttony, one of the 7 deadly sins, wasn't only about overeating, it was about eating for pleasure, especially when the food was simple, cheap, and deeply satisfying. Street food, sold hot and greasy, was suspect. Sermons warned against indulgence. Priests denounced fritters and meat pies as temptations, not because they were extravagant, but because they distracted the poor from humility. A warm sausage roll might not damn your soul, but it symbolized misplaced priorities. In Florence, moral reformers called Piagnoni advocated for the elimination of frivolous public amusements, including festivals, dancing, and the sale of sweet or fried foods. What's more indulgent than a fritter dipped in honey? Street food was painted as both physical and spiritual pollution. But the reality was this: people needed it, and they loved it. City officials in Paris, London, and Venice issued more food laws in the 14th century. Many of them targeted unlicensed vendors. Others aimed to standardize prices and ingredients. In London, ordinances in the late 1300s prohibited the sale of pies filled with rotten or old flesh. Cooks were warned not to reuse old grease or serve meat left out overnight. Vendors who broke these rules could be fined, pilloried, or banned from trading. In Florence, the Arte dei Cuoiai, a guild of butchers and food preparers, attempted to monopolize the preparation of all meat-based street foods. Independent cooks found themselves squeezed out, but for every fine or restriction, a dozen vendors returned. Often women, often widowed or poor, they continued to cook because it was one of the few economic options open to them. In fact, many medieval food vendors were women. They ran pie shops, carried trays of fried snacks through crowded alleys, and sold baked goods from windows. Some were harassed for it. Others became small-time entrepreneurs. These women formed a quiet resistance against the narrowing of urban food access. As the medieval world became more stratified, food reflected status. Guilds controlled the quality and price of goods. Bakers, brewers, fishmongers, and butchers all had their own strict regulations. But the street vendor, often guildless, often unprotected. This meant that while a butcher could sell sausage in his shop with city approval, a sausage seller on the street might be fined, even if her product was cheaper and more accessible to the poor. And that was the point. Food was becoming not just about survival or pleasure, but about class. The wealthy dined indoors on multi-course meals. The middle classes bought from licensed shops. The poor, increasingly, were being discouraged, even forbidden, from eating publicly prepared food, especially if it was made by other poor people. But still they came, drawn by the scent of warm pastry or the sizzle of meat in fat. The marketplace became a space of tension, a dance between control and desire, order and appetite. Despite the crackdowns, there were moments when food rules relaxed, One of the most important was Carnival, the pre-Lenten festival celebrated across Catholic Europe. During Carnival, order was inverted. Peasants dressed as nobles, women mocked men, and food, especially greasy over-the-top snack food, was consumed with wild abandon. Fritters, pancakes, sugar-coated nuts, fried cheese balls, meat pies in absurd shapes, all became part of the festival table. Vendors flooded the streets, sometimes outnumbering the celebrants. For a few days, fried food was not only tolerated, it was celebrated. Authorities wrung their hands, but Carnival was too popular, too entrenched to stop, and street vendors made most of their annual income during this time. It was a brief moment of culinary freedom before the long fast of Lent, where even eggs and dairy were banned. The people made up for it with one more sticky fritter, one more steaming skewer of meat. Then came another force, more powerful than any law: disease. The arrival of the Black Death in the mid-14th century reshaped every aspect of life, including how people viewed public food. As plague swept through towns, people blamed markets, open-air food stalls, and foreign ingredients. The miasma theory, the belief that disease came from bad air, meant that the smells of food became suspect. Fried fat, rotting meat, and spoiled fish were seen as carriers of death. Many cities temporarily banned street food entirely during outbreaks. Market stalls were closed, vendors were driven out, but again, people still needed to eat. And so, as soon as the plague eased, the carts returned. Some vendors adapted. They sold pre-wrapped foods. Others stayed on the edges of town, near taverns or stables. Some changed recipes to include spices thought to ward off sickness: pepper, vinegar, garlic. Street food survived the plague not because it was essential, but because it was inevitable. By the end of the 15th century, snack foods had become fully woven into urban life. Despite the best efforts of moralists and officials, they had changed form. Pies were smaller, flatter, and easier to carry. Fritters used newer ingredients, like sugar brought in from colonies. Cookshops became semi-legitimate businesses. In Venice, lists of street food licenses show over 100 vendors operating year-round by the 1480s. In London, pie shops near the Thames catered to dock workers, and at the edge of universities like Oxford and Cambridge, students bought meat buns and ale between lectures. Street food had endured centuries of suspicion, poverty, war, and plague. Because it was more than food, it was rhythm, survival, comfort. But what happened as new ingredients arrived? From distant lands, chocolate, chili peppers, tomatoes, and sugar. How did the junk food of the medieval world evolve as the Middle Ages drew to a close and the early modern world dawned? The humble street snack, the pies, fritters, and skewered meats once sold by commoners in muddy markets, faced a new kind of transformation. It wasn't just religion or regulation anymore. It was the world itself expanding. Trade, conquest, colonization, and the rise of global empires brought new ingredients, flavors, and techniques to Europe and beyond. With it came a reinvention of what the common snack could be. Some dishes disappeared, others evolved, and some were reborn under new names with new meanings. But the spirit remained: quick, cheap, hot, and usually a little greasy. When Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, he set off more than just a geopolitical chain reaction. The Columbian Exchange, the vast movement of plants, animals, and foods between the Old and New Worlds, profoundly changed global diets. For the medieval snack cart, this was a culinary earthquake. Suddenly, vendors had access to chili peppers from the Americas, tomatoes, initially feared, then embraced in southern Europe, maize, corn, potatoes, not widely popular until later, but transformative, and most importantly, cane sugar in large quantities from colonial plantations. These ingredients reshaped both sweet and savory snacks. Fritters were now dusted with real sugar instead of honey. Sausages and stews began incorporating chili and tomato. In Spain and Italy, simple flatbreads began their slow evolution into what would become pizza. In markets from Lisbon to Naples, the old pies of the Middle Ages became saucier, spicier, and, eventually, cheesier. Street food began to flirt with flavor. By the 16th and 17th centuries, some foods that began as street snacks were absorbed into national identity. Empanadas, with origins in Moorish meat pies and medieval Spanish cookery, became common throughout the Spanish Empire. Pasties in Cornwall developed as miners' snacks. Portable, durable, and filling, descended from earlier pie traditions. Samosas continued to spread east and west, changing with each culture that embraced them. Fried dough, in various forms, turned up across Europe and the Middle East, from Polish paczki to Turkish lokma, and later French beignets. These were once the junk food of the streets, casual, unrespected, eaten with fingers, sold for pennies. Now they were regional icons, still humble, still beloved. Perhaps the most dramatic change to medieval-style snack food came with sugar. In the 1400s, sugar was rare and medicinal. By the 1600s, it was everywhere, driven by slave labor in Caribbean plantations and European demand. Street foods adapted quickly. Vendors offered sugar-coated nuts, sometimes flavored with cinnamon or clove, fried fruit fritters with syrup, candied apples and plums, and small cakes soaked in sugar and rosewater. In many cities, sugar shops appeared, precursors to the modern candy store. But outside those, women still sold sweet snacks on the street, often made at home and sold from baskets or trays. Sugar democratized pleasure, but at a terrible human cost. Few snackers knew their treats were the result of brutal colonial economies, but the sweetness of the food masked the bitterness behind it. As Europe encountered coffee from Arabia and tea from China, new snack rituals evolved. By the 17th century, urban cafes emerged, especially in cities like Paris, London, and Istanbul. People didn't just want a drink, they wanted something to eat with it. Out came small cakes, spiced nuts, sugared buns, and, eventually, biscuits and pastries. In this way, the street snack culture of the medieval world began moving indoors. The working poor still bought pies and sausage from stalls, but the growing middle class now snacked in public spaces of refinement. A social divide widened. The food might be similar, but its context determined its respectability. Even so, outside the cafe walls, carts still clattered down cobbled streets, smoke still rose from iron griddles, and customers still ate with their hands. As early modern governments grew stronger and more centralized, food regulation reached new heights. Vendors were required to register. Health inspections became more routine, and cleanliness became the new moral standard. In London, vendors were forced to wear clean aprons and cover their hair. In Paris, officials cracked down on selling impure oils used in frying. In Ottoman Istanbul, snack vendors had to recite prayers for their goods and post prices to avoid price gouging. The marketplace wasn't lawless anymore, but it was still lively. And despite these changes, many vendors continued without permits, on the edge of legality, because demand always outpaced control. By the 18th century, few people remembered the simple fritters and pies of 13th century markets. But their legacy was everywhere. In Japan's yatai stalls selling grilled skewers, in India's chaat vendors hawking crispy, spicy, sour mixtures, in Britain's pie shops along factory lines, and in Mexico's antojitos, or little cravings. The form persisted: cheap, warm, easy to carry, eaten not at the table but at the threshold, on the go between errands, while watching performers or waiting in line. Junk food, long before the term was invented, the hunger for it, unchanged. The medieval street snack reveals something quietly profound about human life, that the need for quick comfort is timeless. That flavor and survival often walk hand in hand. That food doesn't need to be grand to be meaningful. These snacks weren't just indulgences, they were acts of survival, of joy even in poverty, of connection between cook and eater, vendor and city, hunger and home. For hundreds of years, street vendors across cultures and continents risked fines, ridicule, even disease to provide those bites, and we're still eating them. Every time someone grabs a hand pie, a bag of roasted nuts, or a deep-fried fritter, they echo that ancient craving to feed ourselves quickly and well with whatever's hot and close. As you move on from the food stalls of the past, ask yourself, what future archaeologists might think when they uncover a modern fast food wrapper? Would they recognize it as the descendant of the medieval meat pie? Few things are as universally human and as historically overlooked as the need to relieve oneself. But for most of history, answering nature's call wasn't a private or comfortable affair. It was public, it was political, and often it was a source of chaos, disease, and bitter neighborhood disputes. Welcome to the world of medieval sanitation. A surprisingly complex, often disgusting, but absolutely vital part of daily life. Forget chivalry kings or cathedrals. This is the real story of how people manage their most basic bodily function in a world without indoor plumbing. Let's begin at the start of a typical medieval day. Before the first bell rang from the local church tower, before fires were stoked or bread broken, many people reached for a humble but essential object, the chamber pot. Usually made of ceramic, metal, or even wood lined with pitch, chamber pots were kept under beds or benches in homes, castles, monasteries, and even workshops. They were not elegant, but they worked. After use, the contents were often unceremoniously tossed out the window or door, frequently into open gutters that lined the centre of the street. In London and Paris, residents were legally required to shout a warning, something like "Gardez-lou," from the French "Gardez l'eau," or "Watch out for the water," before dumping the pot's contents. As cities grew more crowded, so did the complaints, because what went out didn't just vanish. For wealthier homes and institutions, like monasteries, castles, and guild halls, the preferred solution was the privy, a simple seat or hole located over a pit, often connected to a chute or a cesspool. Privies could be standalone buildings in a courtyard or cleverly integrated into the stonework of towers, with gravity doing most of the work. Some castles even had garderobes projecting outward over moats or rivers, letting waste fall directly into the water below. The term garderobe also referred to a wardrobe, because some people believed the strong ammonia fumes kept moths away from clothes. Sanitation meets pest control. In cities, however, privies were far less elegant. Urban privies were tiny wooden shacks perched over cesspits. Some were communal. Many were shared by entire tenement buildings, and few were cleaned regularly. By the 14th century, public health records from cities like York and Cologne begin to show growing concern over overflowing cesspits, collapsing privies, and the spread of disease, especially during the hot summer months. One 1326 report from London described a cesspit so large and neglected that it collapsed into a neighbouring wine cellar, flooding it with human waste. The wine merchant sued. The privy owner claimed ignorance. The city fined them both. Welcome to medieval wastewater politics. You might ask, who cleaned this all up? Enter the gong farmer, an actual job title in medieval England, referring to men hired to shovel out human waste from cesspits and privies. Gong. Farmers usually worked at night to avoid offending passers-by and to limit exposure to fumes. They carried their waste in carts to dumping grounds outside the city. In London, the contents might be dumped into the Thames or sold as fertilizer to nearby farmers. It was dangerous work. Toxic gases in deep cesspits could suffocate a man in seconds. Some workers passed out and drowned in their own collections. Others were forced to strip naked to do the job properly, their clothing ruined by repeated exposure. Yet the pay could be surprisingly good. Some made more than skilled craftsmen. The job was essential, but it was also stigmatized. Gong farmers lived on the fringes of society, dirty, necessary, and quietly resented. In other parts of the world, similar roles existed. In Ottoman cities, night soil collectors operated under strict municipal rules. In Ming Dynasty China, privy workers were part of regulated guilds. In 18th century Japan, night soil was carefully collected, traded, and used to enrich rice paddies. In many places, human waste was not garbage. It was a resource, still gross, but at least productive. In some larger medieval cities, public toilets existed, often near markets, churches, or docks. These ranged from large multi-seat stone or wooden structures to simple wooden platforms, with a row of holes. Water might be channeled beneath them to carry waste away. But most had no privacy. You sat shoulder to shoulder with strangers.
Conversations happened, arguments broke out, sometimes even fights. In certain cities, the latrines were gender separated, but not always. Modesty was encouraged, but function came first. One preserved Roman latrine in Ephesus has over a dozen holes lined up with no dividers. In medieval reconstructions, similar patterns emerge. Going to the toilet in public meant exposure, not just physically but socially. It was often humiliating for women, for the elderly, and for people of low status. And yet, for many, it was the only option. By the 13th and 14th centuries, cities began constructing drainage systems, basic stone or wooden channels that carried rainwater and waste away from the streets. But these were shallow, often clogged, and rarely cleaned. Rivers and streams doubled as open sewers. In London, the Fleet River became so polluted that by the 1500s it was described as stinking and utterly corrupt. Alewives dumped mash, butchers dumped offal, tanneries poured out toxic lye, and atop it all, the city's people dumped their waste. Small wonder that disease spread rapidly. Cholera and dysentery were endemic. The Black Death's arrival in 1347 only amplified the urgency of improving sanitation, though with limited tools. Doctors and authorities recognized the connection between filth and illness, but the germ theory of disease was centuries away. Instead, they blamed miasmas, bad air, and responded by burning incense or carrying sweet herbs, not by fixing drainage. And yet slowly change began. As cities swelled and societies grew more conscious of health and order, how did waste management evolve? Who controlled sanitation in the early modern world? And how did it shape social status, urban planning, and public health in unexpected ways? By the 15th century, The problem of waste disposal in growing urban centers had become too large and too pungent to ignore. Cities like Paris, London, and Florence were choking on their own filth. Open sewers, overflowing cesspits, and backyard privies posed not only aesthetic and health problems, but also serious social and political ones. Who was responsible for cleaning it up? Who paid? And more importantly, who got to go in peace and privacy, and who did? This section explores how human waste became a tool of power, how sanitation was a mirror for class divisions, and how the fight over privy rights led to what could only be called privy wars. As urban sanitation grew more regulated, so too did the distinctions between public and private relief. For the wealthy, the solution was simple: build better privies. Nobles, merchants, and high-ranking clergy constructed indoor guardrobes or stone privy towers with chutes emptying into moats, cesspits, or canals. In England, these were sometimes equipped with bench seats, shelves for candles, and even basic ventilation systems. Some were lined with straw or cloth for comfort. Castles often included multiple privies, some large enough for two people to sit side by side, possibly intended for lords and their trusted advisors to continue meetings during necessary breaks. The ultimate sign of status: a private servant to empty and clean your chamber pot discreetly and daily. Poorer residents had fewer options. They shared backyard privies with other families, used chamber pots emptied into the street, or visited fee-based public latrines when available. Access to privacy, cleanliness, and dignity while relieving oneself was not a given. It was earned or paid for. As cities grew, so did demand for better waste management. By the late 1500s, some municipalities began issuing contracts to private individuals for cesspit emptying, public privy maintenance, and even street cleaning. These jobs were frequently assigned through competitive bidding. The lowest bidder would often be granted a monopoly on waste removal within a city ward. Thus began the privy economy, a shadow industry operating at night, paid by the bucket and rife with corruption. Some contractors dumped waste illegally. Others skimmed off fees. A few even resold human waste to rural farmers as fertilizer. In Amsterdam, waste was collected from household privies and loaded onto barges, floating dungboats, to be transported into the countryside. In Edo period Japan, human waste was a valuable commodity, often sold between city dwellers and farmers by the scoop. Wealthier households, with diets rich in rice and vegetables, produced more valuable waste. Contracts were drawn up and renewed annually. It was literally worth fighting over. As cities densified, access to communal privies became a source of daily conflict. Alleyways were blocked by unauthorized stalls. Neighbors accused each other of dumping waste in the wrong place. Privy pits sometimes crossed property lines, causing bitter lawsuits. In London, court records from the 16th and 17th centuries are full of cases like a widow suing her neighbor for building a privy that leaked into her cellar, tenants refusing to pay rent after discovering the communal privy had collapsed into a chicken coop, merchants accusing each other of blocking access to alleyway latrines to divert customers. These weren't just hygiene issues. They were battles over dignity, access, and the right to basic infrastructure. Sometimes they turned violent. A 1621 brawl in York began when a dispute over night soil removal escalated into stone throwing and arrests. In a world without formal plumbing, the location of a privy was power, and people defended their turf fiercely. For women, the challenges were even greater. Public toilets were rare, and many required payment. Women often lacked the freedom to visit them without drawing attention or facing harassment. As a result, many relied on chamber pots or discreet urination in alleyways, especially at night. In markets, women sellers sometimes used buckets under their stalls. In homes, Female servants were often tasked with emptying waste, quietly and without complaint. In wealthier households, the close stool, a wooden chair with a chamber pot beneath a padded lid, offered greater comfort. Nobles used them during long banquets or court sessions. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly had a velvet-lined close stool with silver fittings. Yet no matter how elegant, the act was the same, the need universal. Gender, class, and status all shaped the experience, but no one, not even monarchs, was immune to the call of nature. In a world where sewage ran underfoot, the control of odor became a social obsession. The wealthy wore pomanders, small decorative containers filled with herbs and spices, to ward off bad smells. Churches burned incense not only for spiritual reasons, but also to mask the stench of large gatherings. Perfumed gloves, scented handkerchiefs, and sprigs of lavender or rosemary were used by both men and women to purify the air they breathed. But beneath the surface, this obsession reflected deeper fears of contamination, of low status, of proximity to unclean labor and people. The more one could distance oneself from the act of elimination, the more refined they were considered. And yet the reality remained. Everyone went, and in most cases someone else had to clean it up. Toward the end of the early modern period, public officials began thinking of waste not just as a nuisance, but as a health hazard. In 1665, during London's Great Plague, inspectors were assigned to clean streets, remove waste, and burn contaminated materials. It was an imperfect response, but it marked a shift, the beginnings of sanitation as public health. By the 18th century, cities like Edinburgh, Paris, and Stockholm were developing better drainage systems, building more public latrines, and assigning waste collection to professional guilds. Still, the work was dirty. Still, access remained unequal. And yet, step by step, the modern sanitation infrastructure we rely on today was taking shape, born out of centuries of frustration, conflict, and quiet necessity. As engineers and city planners began to invent more sophisticated waste systems, how did the introduction of sewers, toilets, and indoor plumbing change daily life? And who was left behind in the transition to modern sanitation? By the dawn of the 19th century, the great cities of the world were groaning under the weight of their own progress. Populations soared, streets filled, tenements stacked atop one another, and the simple act of going to the bathroom was more complicated and more dangerous than ever before. But change was coming. The final chapter in the history of pre-modern sanitation was not a story of new ideas, but of desperation. It would take plague, protest, and revolting stench to convince governments to invest in toilets and underground sewers. And even then, access remained far from equal. This section follows the transformation of sanitation from a chaotic, privatized service to a centralized, engineered system, and what was gained and lost in the transition. In 19th century Paris, Baron Haussmann's dramatic redesign of the city, its broad boulevards and elegant squares, also included something less glamorous, one of the first modern sewer systems. Below the surface, miles of tunnels were laid to carry waste out of the city and into the Seine. While not fully hygienic by today's standards, it was a vast improvement over the open ditches and cesspits that had served the city for centuries. Meanwhile, in London, the Great Stink of 1858 forced Parliament into action. The Thames, long used as a dumping ground for both human and industrial waste, had become unbearable. On hot days, the smell was so intense that politicians considered abandoning Westminster altogether. Enter Sir Joseph Bazalgette, a civil engineer who designed a massive underground sewer system. Completed in the 1860s, it redirected London's waste downstream, away from the city's drinking water intake. The result, a dramatic drop in cholera and other waterborne diseases. Public health transformed, literally overnight. But not everyone benefited equally. Despite the advances in sewer infrastructure, access to indoor toilets remained a luxury well into the 20th century. In London, middle and upper-class homes were among the first to install flush toilets, porcelain bowls, and connected pipes. These water closets were seen as both hygienic and fashionable. But for the urban poor, particularly in overcrowded neighborhoods like Whitechapel or Southwark, little changed. Families shared outdoor privies. Chamber pots were still emptied into alleys. Night soil men continued their rounds until well into the 1900s. In New York City, immigrant tenements often had one shared privy per floor or even per building. Disease spread quickly. Children died young. Women risked harassment when relieving themselves in alleyways at night. Even as toilets became more refined, sanitation remained a privilege. With the spread of sewer systems and plumbing came a new ideology: cleanliness as morality. Victorian culture promoted the idea that personal hygiene reflected inner virtue. To be clean was to be civilized. Dirty bodies, especially those of the poor, the colonized, or the differently abled, were seen as signs of inferiority. Toilet training, bathing, and the use of deodorizing powders became tools of respectability. Middle-class homes installed washrooms not just for health, but for social performance. The toilet became a symbol of privacy, order, and control. In this way, the flush toilet did more than dispose of waste. It helped construct a new ideal of the modern human: discreet, clean, contained. But even this progress came at a cost. As European empires expanded across Asia, Africa, and the Americas, sanitation became a tool of colonial power. Colonial administrators introduced sewer systems and flush toilets to parts of India, Egypt, and the Caribbean, but only in administrative zones, military barracks, or elite residences. Native populations were often excluded. Public health campaigns emphasized Western toilet use while demonizing traditional practices such as squat toilets, dry composting, or shared latrines. Indigenous systems, some of which were sustainable and well adapted to local environments, were dismissed as unclean. The flush toilet became an agent of cultural erasure. In many regions, this legacy remains. Rural and poor urban communities in post-colonial countries often still lack access to modern sanitation. Open defecation persists not from choice, but from historical neglect. Even today, the toilet divide, who gets one and who doesn't, is a global marker of inequality. With the rise of sewers and plumbing, the old sanitation professions vanished. The gong farmer, the night soil man, the bucket collector, all became obsolete. Their dirty work was no longer visible. Machines replaced them. Waste disappeared with the push of a lever. And yet something else was lost. The knowledge of composting, soil enrichment, and low-water sanitation disappeared along with them. In industrialized countries, human waste stopped being a resource and became something to be flushed and forgotten. It was efficient, it was clean, but it was also incredibly wasteful. Today, some environmentalists advocate a return to composting toilets and eco-sanitation. But for most, the water-wasting porcelain bowl remains king. It's easy to forget just how recent the toilet revolution was. In Britain, the majority of homes did not have indoor toilets until after World War II. In the U.S., rural communities relied on outhouses into the 1960s. In much of the world, the transition is still incomplete. Yet we rarely talk about it. Sanitation is a private topic, an invisible infrastructure, but without it, modern life would collapse. Flush toilets, sewer lines, wastewater treatment plants, these are the arteries of civilization. And they all descend from chamber pots, from wooden privies, from stinking alleys and midnight carts. From people who, for centuries, did the dirtiest work imaginable, so the rest of us could live just a little bit cleaner. So next time you flush a toilet or turn a tap, consider this. How did something so essential become so silent? And who still lives without it, managing waste as our ancestors once did, in the open air, with little more than a pot and a prayer? In a world before soap was common, before daily baths were routine, and before washing machines existed, there was an ever-present, endlessly irritating companion: lice. These tiny, biting parasites were more than a nuisance. They shaped hygiene practices, inspired superstition, and influenced everything from fashion to warfare. They crawled through history, thriving in the seams of royal robes and under the caps of monks. They were a mark of humanity itself, ubiquitous, unavoidable, and in many cases, unknowable. In this section, we'll explore the itchy reality of lice in the medieval world, where they came from, how people fought them, and how they became a quiet but constant influence on the course of civilization. The average medieval person, regardless of wealth or class, carried lice. They lived in clothes, in bedding, in hair and beards. Children had them. Monks had them. Kings had them. Lice didn't discriminate based on status, only on opportunity. There are three major types of lice that have followed humans through history. Head lice, Pediculus humanus capitis. Body lice, Pediculus humanus corporis. And pubic lice, P. thurus pubis, sometimes called crabs. Body lice, in particular, thrived in the unwashed folds of undergarments and linen. Unlike head lice, which cling to hair, body lice hide in clothing and only crawl onto the skin to feed. This meant that your tunic or shift wasn't just keeping you warm, it was carrying a mobile colony of parasites. The itching could be unbearable. Scratching was constant. Open sores, rashes, and skin infections were common, and yet people largely accepted lice as part of life, because they had no real choice. Despite stereotypes, medieval people did not embrace filth. Bathing was practiced widely, when possible. Monasteries kept washing basins. Public bathhouses were common in Islamic cities and even in Christian Europe before the rise of moral panic. Herbal rinses, vinegar scrubs, and linen changes were used to reduce parasites. But with lice, the problem wasn't just the skin, it was the clothing. Many people owned only one or two garments, worn constantly and washed rarely. Lice laid eggs in the seams, particularly near the armpits, waist, and groin. Boiling clothes could kill the lice, but boiling damaged fabric, and fuel was expensive. So other methods were tried. Combing. Lice combs with fine metal teeth were used daily, especially in monasteries and noble courts. Some combs survive today in archaeological digs, often with trapped lice and eggs still embedded. Shaving. Monks and some clergy shaved their heads not just as a religious act, but to limit lice. Baldness made it easier to see and remove them. Dusting. Ash, powdered herbs, or even crushed rosemary were rubbed into the skin to deter lice. Fumigation. Clothes were smoked over herbs like sage or lavender, though this often just encouraged the lice to migrate to other garments or the body. None of these methods worked perfectly. Most people simply endured the itching. Medieval literature and folk stories often included lice as symbols of shame or punishment. Dirty beggars were described as lousy. The term survives today, rooted in the word for lice. But lice also showed up in humor. Jokes about lovers finding lice in each other's hair were common. Schoolboys were teased for having lice. Poets used them as metaphors for petty grievances that gnawed at the soul. In some regions, people believed that lice were a punishment for vanity or impure thoughts. In others, lice were considered part of divine suffering. Jesus himself was believed by some to have endured lice as a symbol of humility. In Jewish tradition, lice played a role in the biblical plagues of Egypt. In Christian sermons, they were a reminder of human sinfulness. In folk medicine, They were sometimes thought to be generated by bile, bad air, or poor temperament, part of the humoral theory of disease. People didn't fully understand lice, but they knew they were part of life. In monasteries, rules of hygiene were strict, but lice still flourished. Benedictine monks were instructed to wash regularly, change linen weekly, and keep their dormitories clean. Still, lice outbreaks were common. Some monastic orders kept detailed records of lice combs, linen washes, and treatments. Others embraced lice as a kind of spiritual discipline. A 12th century Cistercian monk wrote in his diary that he welcomed lice as instruments of God's correction, teaching humility and patience through suffering. But not everyone agreed. At Cluny Abbey, monks were punished for bringing lice into the library, where delicate manuscripts were at risk of contamination. Even saints were not spared. Stories of Saint Francis of Assisi mention his willingness to tolerate lice as part of his vow of poverty. Other hagiographies describe holy men whose lice mysteriously vanished after divine visions, proof, perhaps, of sanctification. But for most monks, lice were just another part of daily penance, like cold floors, rough bread, and long hours of silent prayer. Soldiers were some of the most lice-ridden people in the medieval world. Armies lived in camps, shared beds, and wore armor and clothing for weeks at a time. Hygiene was nearly impossible. Infestation was inevitable. Lice not only caused discomfort, they spread disease. Body lice are known carriers of typhus, a deadly bacterial infection that causes fever, rash, and delirium. While typhus wasn't fully identified until much later, outbreaks in medieval armies may well have been linked to lice. During the Crusades, chroniclers noted widespread illness among soldiers, describing symptoms consistent with louse-borne fevers. Commanders often blamed bad air or divine judgment, but lice may have been the true enemy. In siege warfare, lice multiplied rapidly. Confined populations, poor sanitation, and stress created perfect breeding grounds. And morale suffered. Letters from medieval mercenaries complained not just of hunger or wounds, but of biting vermin in their bedrolls. Even knights scratched. But as the Renaissance dawned and new knowledge flowed through Europe, did people finally learn how to fight the itch? How did early science, new fabrics, and changing attitudes reshape the battle against lice, and who finally began to win it? By the end of the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the world began to itch a little differently. Trade networks expanded, new fabrics circulated, the printing press spread ideas, including those about hygiene, and gradually the medieval understanding of lice began to evolve from superstition to early science. Still, for centuries, one thing remained consistent: people kept scratching. In this section, we'll follow the war against lice as it moved from monk cells and castle courtyards into the hands of early modern physicians, barbers, and inventors. The battle wasn't just physical, it was cultural, scientific, and deeply personal. One of the most important tools in the fight against lice didn't come from medicine, but from textiles. Linen made from the flax plant was smoother, less porous, and easier to clean than wool or coarse cotton. By the 15th and 16th centuries, as linen production spread across Europe, it began replacing woolen undergarments and bedding in many households. This mattered because body lice lived and laid eggs in clothing, not on the skin itself, and linen could be boiled. Boiling was one of the few surefire methods to kill lice and their nits, eggs. As the concept of boiling linen became more common, especially among the middle class, lice infestations declined slightly in wealthier homes. Still, linen was expensive. The poor continued to wear wool, often unwashed, for months at a time. In crowded cities, lice remained a fact of life. In wealthier homes, servants were tasked with boiling underclothes. In larger households, linen closets and wash schedules became tools of status. A clean shirt didn't just mean hygiene. It meant you could afford labor, soap, and fuel. Lice became, slowly, a marker of class. During this period, barbers did far more than cut hair. They were minor surgeons, bloodletters, tooth pullers, and often lice removers. Barbers shaved heads, cleaned wounds, and examined scalps. In urban centers like London, Vienna, and Naples, barbers advertised their skill in ridding clients of lice using combs, oils, and herbal rinses. Common treatments included vinegar washes, believed to dislodge lice eggs; mercury ointments, toxic but common; camphor oil, to cool the skin and drive out insects. Bathhouses also played a role. Though controversial among moralists, public bathhouses flourished in early Renaissance cities. Steam, soap, and hot water could temporarily relieve infestations, though reinfestation was almost inevitable. Some bathhouses even provided delousing services as a side business, offering clients fresh bedding and clean linen. Still, none of this cured the problem, because lice always came back, hitching rides in seams, collars, and coifs. The 17th century brought a profound shift in how humans understood the microscopic world. In 1665, Robert Hooke published Micrographia, a groundbreaking book that used a microscope to observe and illustrate tiny life forms. Among the most famous images, a detailed drawing of a louse. Hooke described it as a most loathsome creature, but marveled at its complex legs, claws, and jaws. For the first time, people could see the enemy in sharp detail. A few decades later, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, a Dutch cloth merchant and amateur scientist, used his improved microscope to study lice eggs. He observed how they hatched, what they ate, and how they clung to fibers. These discoveries did not stop infestations, but they demystified them. Lice were no longer divine punishment or spontaneous generation. They were insects, parasitic, biological, studyable. And that made them, at least in theory, beatable. In Enlightenment Europe, as reason and science gained prestige, personal cleanliness became not only a virtue but a moral imperative. Writers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau promoted the idea that cleanliness shaped character. A clean child was an educated child. A clean man was a rational man. And lice, they were a sign of failure, of sloth, of poverty. This marked a shift from medieval tolerance to early modern shame. Lice had always been uncomfortable, but now they were unacceptable. Women's manuals from the 18th century included detailed instructions for laundering clothes weekly, airing bedding, and applying lice treatments. Mothers combed their children's hair daily. Barbers and bathhouses lost prestige as people installed basins in their homes. Yet the shame wasn't evenly distributed. Working-class families, without servants, soap, or spare linen, couldn't keep up. Children were sent home from schools. Servants were dismissed. Boarding houses refused entry. Lice went from common problem to class stigma. Ironically, the aristocracy found new ways to encourage lice, even while trying to escape them. In the 17th and 18th centuries, powdered wigs became fashionable among European elites. These towering, curled, often shared wigs were hotbeds for lice. To combat the infestation, wigs were removed nightly and set on stands, powdered with starch, sometimes mixed with sulfur or mercury to deter lice, heavily perfumed, masking the sour smell of old hair and parasites. Some wigs were shared between brothers, cousins, or even rented for special occasions, passing lice along with fashion. The irony: the very people who most abhorred lice, who punished others for harboring them, were quietly feeding entire colonies of them beneath their wigs. Eventually, wigs fell out of favor, but not before lice had enjoyed a golden age at the highest levels of power. While fashion and class battled lice quietly, war continued to spread them loudly. From the Napoleonic Wars to the American Civil War, Soldiers endured infested uniforms, filthy barracks, and poor hygiene. In the Napoleonic army, soldiers called lice graybacks and made a sport of crushing them between fingernails. Napoleon himself acknowledged lice as a greater enemy than the Russians. But it wasn't just discomfort. Body lice carried disease, most notably epidemic typhus. While not fully understood at the time, typhus was responsible for millions of deaths between the 16th and 19th centuries. During the 1812 retreat from Moscow, Napoleon's army lost more men to typhus than to enemy action. Lice were the vector. This weaponless killer reshaped military outcomes, political borders, and human history, one tiny bite at a time. But even as science advanced and society became obsessed with hygiene, lice remained. Why? And how did the 20th century finally tip the scales in humanity's favor, at least for a while? Despite centuries of scrubbing, combing, boiling, shaving, and scolding, lice remained one of humanity's most persistent enemies. They were a part of daily life for emperors and peasants, soldiers and saints. But by the 20th century, science, public health, and war would converge in a final, coordinated assault on these ancient parasites. Lice would go from being expected to being unacceptable, no longer a fact of life, but a failure of cleanliness, education, or state planning. This is the story of how we almost won the war on lice, and why, even now, they haven't quite let go. In World War I, lice followed soldiers into trenches across Europe. Nicknamed chats or cooties, they infested uniforms, bedding, and body hair. The scratching was relentless. Red marks appeared in armpits and waistlines. Morale suffered. And worse, typhus. Although the bacterium Rickettsia prausea had been identified in 1916, it wasn't until after the war that medical authorities fully understood how body lice transmitted epidemic typhus. This knowledge would change global public health. To combat lice in the trenches, militaries employed delousing stations, where soldiers were forced to strip and pass through steam chambers, insecticidal powders, including naphthalene and sulfur, hot washing of uniforms in large rotating vats. But none of these solutions were perfect, and lice returned again and again. Still, the scale of war forced innovation. World War II brought even more urgency, and a weapon that would change everything. In 1939, Swiss chemist Paul Hermann Müller discovered the insecticidal properties of DDT, dichlorodiphenyltrichloroethane. It was cheap, effective, and could be sprayed directly onto the human body. DDT killed lice on contact and prevented reinfestation for weeks. By the mid-1940s, the Allies were dusting entire populations with DDT in delousing campaigns. Soldiers were sprayed during deployment and demobilization. Refugees and concentration camp survivors were treated in camps across Europe. Civilians in Italy, North Africa, and Asia received routine applications to prevent typhus outbreaks. It worked. For the first time in history, lice could be eliminated, not just managed. The World Health Organization and the United Nations supported DDT programs across the developing world. School children were dusted. Rural families were visited by health workers with canisters. Lice vanished. But there was a cost. By the 1970s, scientists began noticing something troubling. Lice were returning, and they weren't dying from DDT anymore. Insects reproduce quickly, and with each generation, those that survived treatment passed on their resistance. Soon, entire populations of DDT-resistant lice were thriving where others had died. Meanwhile, DDT's environmental impact became impossible to ignore. It accumulated in ecosystems, poisoned birds, and entered the human food chain. In 1972, the U.S. banned its agricultural use. Other countries followed. By the 1980s, lice were resurgent. not just in war zones and refugee camps, but in schools, daycares, and urban households. The ancient enemy had returned, stronger and smarter. By the late 20th century, lice were no longer an affliction of soldiers or peasants, but of middle-class schoolchildren. Across Europe, North America, and Asia, head lice made a surprising comeback. Unlike body lice, they didn't spread disease, but they spread panic. Parents rushed to pharmacies. Schools sent home warnings. Children were shamed, isolated, and sometimes excluded. The association of lice with dirtiness had never gone away, it had simply shifted targets. Ironically, lice thrived in clean environments. They loved fine, soft hair. Shared headphones, lockers, and jackets in modern classrooms were perfect transmission tools. Chemical shampoos, combing kits, and home treatments became an industry. Some worked, others didn't. Resistance grew. The cycle continued. Even now, lice remain a serious problem in parts of the world. In refugee camps, war zones, prisons, and overcrowded housing, body lice continue to spread typhus and trench fever. Outbreaks have been recorded in Ethiopia, South Sudan, and among homeless populations in Europe and the US. Treatment is difficult. Resistance to drugs like permethrin and malathion is widespread. Boiling clothes and bedding is effective, but often impossible in crisis situations. The modern response to lice has moved beyond chemicals. Wet combing and physical removal are encouraged. Essential oils like tea tree or lavender are promoted, though results vary. Public education focuses on reducing stigma and increasing awareness. Still, in many places, being lousy remains a mark of shame. And in others, it remains just normal. Ironically, modern environmentalists are now re-examining older methods once discarded. Dry sanitation, linen clothing, vinegar rinses, and herbal insect repellents, once considered primitive, are being revisited for their sustainability and resilience against resistance. Researchers have found that lice avoid certain plant compounds. New comb designs draw inspiration from medieval artifacts, and public health officials increasingly emphasize behavioral change over chemical warfare. What does this mean? It means that despite centuries of science, industry, and progress, we are still fighting the same battle. Scratch by scratch. The story of lice is not just the story of a bug. It's the story of humanity's discomfort with its own biology. The fight against lice has always been a fight for control of our homes, our bodies, our image. Lice challenged the illusion of cleanliness. They blurred the line between rich and poor, civilized and other, holy and base. They were and are a reminder we are animals. We are warm, soft, and vulnerable. And no matter how refined our clothes or ornate our buildings, lice will crawl in, because they always have. But they also taught us resilience, innovation, cooperation. Because in the end, lice are part of our history, not despite our progress, but because of it. So next time you run a fine-toothed comb through your hair, or change your shirt after a long day, consider this. You're participating in a 1,000-year-old ritual of defense against one of the smallest forces ever to shape the world. In a stone chamber lit by a flickering tallow candle, a man sits hunched over a sheet of calfskin. His breath is slow, his eyes are tired, and the quill in his hand scratches rhythmically across the surface. Outside, the bell tolls for the dead. Again. This is the world of the medieval scribe, a life of silence, repetition, and unimaginable focus, unfolding amid a backdrop of plagues, wars, and famine. We remember kings and popes, we memorialize battles and treaties, but without the scribes, the countless anonymous monks, clerks, and copyists, none of it would have survived. They worked not for fame, but for preservation, for obedience, for the slow transfer of human knowledge across centuries. This story explores their world, the quiet lives, the painstaking craft, the battles against time, sickness, and sometimes even censorship. A world where a single mistake could mean the ruin of an entire text, and where ink was as valuable as blood. Medieval manuscripts weren't written in libraries. They were copied in scriptoria, specialized writing rooms found in monasteries, cathedrals, and later, universities. Scriptoria were cold, dim, and often silent. Monks or scribes worked at slanted wooden desks, copying word for word from older texts. A senior monk known as the armarius oversaw the room, providing parchment, ink, and sometimes correction. Lighting was a challenge. Candles were expensive and dangerous. Natural light was preferred but unreliable. Many scribes suffered from vision problems, joint pain, or infection from hours spent in still, damp conditions. There was no backspace key, no Control+Z. Mistakes were scraped away with a knife. If the parchment tore or the ink bled, the entire sheet might be discarded, wasting hours of labor and precious calfskin. Still they persisted. Quiet, steady hands preserving theology, philosophy, science, and law, one line at a time. Books were not made from paper, but from parchment, or more precisely, vellum, a finer quality of parchment made from the skin of unborn or young calves. To make one Bible required the skins of up to 200 animals. Each sheet had to be soaked, scraped, stretched, dried, and trimmed. The process was long and foul-smelling. The result was a smooth, slightly translucent surface that could last for centuries. But it was not cheap. A single book could cost more than a small farm, and so scribes were not just writers, they were conservators of materials worth fortunes. Every blot, every smudge was a financial loss. Every completed folio was a victory. Often used parchment was scraped clean and reused, called palimpsests. Underneath saints, lives, or psalms, modern scientists have discovered hidden layers of older texts, poems, medical treatises, forgotten histories. Sometimes a saint stood atop a pagan. Scribes copied in many languages. Latin dominated Western Europe, Greek persisted in Byzantium, Arabic flourished across North Africa, Spain, and the Middle East. Hebrew was preserved in Jewish communities. Each language had its own calligraphic style, rules, and abbreviations. A single sentence might contain a dozen symbols for and, the, or that. Abbreviation wasn't laziness, it was efficiency. Ink was precious. Parchment was limited. Every curve of the pen was calculated. In Christian scriptoria, the work was often considered an act of devotion. To copy a Bible or a prayer book was to participate in divine labor. Some scribes wrote prayers at the end of each section, asking God for forgiveness for any errors they might have made. And errors did happen. Margins contained centuries of confessions. This page was hard to write. The ink is bad. Thank God it is done. They speak not of dogma, but of fatigue, humility, and humanity. Then came the Black Death. In 1347, plague swept across Europe, killing perhaps a third of the population. Monasteries were devastated. Whole communities of monks and scribes perished. Scriptoria fell silent, copying slowed or stopped altogether. Some manuscripts contain eerie breaks, unfinished lines, abandoned pages. A hand changes mid-text without note. The first scribe died. The next picked up the quill. In the margins, scribes sometimes noted the chaos around them. So many have died and I am alone. Or simply, the plague is here. Books became rarer. Knowledge teetered on the edge of oblivion. But others stepped in. In some cities, lay scribes, non-monastic, often women, began copying texts for universities, lawyers, and merchants. The craft spread beyond the cloister. Writing became a profession, not just a prayer. And with that, the scribe's world began to change. By the 13th century, universities in Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and elsewhere had already been established. The need for books exploded. Texts were now copied in Pichia systems. dividing manuscripts into sections that multiple scribes could copy simultaneously, like an assembly line. Speed increased, though accuracy sometimes suffered. Legal codes, medical treatises, and classical texts were in high demand. These weren't devotional works, they were tools of study and power. Scribes had to be trained, fast, and reliable. Mistakes could mean misinformation or lawsuits. Marginalia from these texts are often more practical than poetic. Beware, copyist omitted a whole paragraph. Corrected from the master copy. Reader, do not trust the previous page. The scribe had become not just a laborer, but a gatekeeper of truth or error. But as presses began to creak and ink met movable type, how did the role of the scribe change? Did their careful hands become obsolete, or did they find new life in an age of mechanical reproduction and mass literacy? By the mid-15th century, the long supremacy of the scribe was under quiet siege. In workshops filled with the scent of oil and lead, a new invention was taking root, the printing press. And with it came a revolution not just in how books were made, but in who controlled knowledge. For more than 1,000 years, the human hand had preserved civilization. Now it would be replaced by movable type, by presses and plates and precision-made machines. The scribe, once a sacred figure, would become obsolete. Or would he? This section traces the strange twilight of the manuscript tradition. The brief moment in history when scribes, printers, and readers all struggled to redefine what a book was and whether the human touch still mattered. In the 1440s, a German goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg developed a system of movable metal type combined with an oil-based ink and a screw press, adapted from those used in winemaking. By 1455, he had produced his masterpiece, the Gutenberg Bible, a 2-volume Latin text so beautifully designed that many thought it was handwritten. Indeed, it included illuminated initials and rubricated margins, finished by hand after printing. This hybrid style fooled some viewers, but to trained scribes it was clear, the rules had changed. The printing press could do in days what once took a scribe years. It didn't tire. It didn't err, at least not in the same ways. It made exact copies over and over. The age of the scribe seemed to end. But scribes did not vanish overnight. Many responded to the press with skepticism or outright hostility. To some, it was a corruption of the sacred. If copying Holy Scripture was a devotional act, what did it mean to reproduce it with machines? In 1470, Italian scribe Giovanni della Luna called printing a dishonorable craft and compared printers to swindlers, flooding the world with ugly, impure texts. Others fought back in subtler ways, by refusing to copy from printed books, considering them tainted, by creating manuscripts with even more ornate calligraphy, emphasizing artistry over speed, by undermining printers, spreading rumors about inaccuracies and theological errors in printed Bibles. Still, the tide turned. By 1500, more than 20 million books had been printed in Europe. By 1600, that number would rise to 150 million. The scribe's monopoly was broken, but not his relevance. In the century following Gutenberg, scribes didn't vanish, they adapted. In universities, scribes continued to copy legal contracts, medical diagrams, and personal letters, genres that printing had yet to fully capture. In religious orders, monks continued to create illuminated texts for ceremonial use. And in the Islamic world, where movable type was slower to spread due to the complexities of Arabic script and religious taboos, scribes continued to dominate book production well into the 18th century. In India, scribal traditions in Sanskrit, Persian, and vernacular languages thrived despite European printing. In China, block printing remained common alongside brush-written texts. The world didn't flip a switch, it transitioned slowly, unevenly. Even in Renaissance Europe, Wealthy patrons commissioned handwritten books as symbols of status and taste. Printed books were for students and scholars. Manuscripts remained works of art. For a time, the scribes survived by becoming rarer and more valuable. One irony of the printing revolution was the illusion of accuracy. While scribes were known to make copying errors, missed words, repeated lines, or marginal notes copied into the text, printers made errors at scale. A single misplaced type block could ruin hundreds of copies. Famous errors include the Wicked Bible, 1631, in which a printer omitted "not" from "thou shalt not commit adultery." A 1562 Geneva Bible that misprinted "he" as "she" in Ruth 3:15, changing a subtle but theologically significant point. These errors made headlines, but they also revealed something important. The scribe's error was personal. The printer's was industrial. Many readers, even centuries later, expressed nostalgia for the handwritten. It felt human. It felt alive. And so, even as the world raced toward mass literacy, a quiet longing remained for ink-stained margins, for imperfect lines, for the press of the scribe's hand. Ironically, as the printing press reduced the need for book copyists, it expanded the demand for bureaucratic scribes. Governments expanding rapidly needed clerks to record births, deaths, and marriages, transcribe laws and ordinances, copy letters and decrees, maintain archives and ledgers. In England, parish clerks became indispensable. In France, notaries handled everything from wills to property disputes. In the Ottoman Empire, scribes formed powerful guilds, known for their penmanship and legal knowledge. The work was different, but the craft survived. Ink, paper, signature, seal. A scribe's labor still held the power to change lives. By the 18th century, printing had conquered the world. Books were cheap. Literacy was rising. Scribes had become rare, sometimes romanticized, sometimes forgotten. But they left a legacy far deeper than their handwriting. They preserved continuity, from empire to monastery, from plague to revolution. They protected ideas that would outlive the buildings they were written in. They taught us that knowledge requires not just brilliance, but patience, precision, and humility. And even now, in the digital age, echoes of their craft remain. Archivists, editors, calligraphers, and even software engineers practice a kind of modern scribing we still value: the exactness of transcription, the trust placed in the written word, and the aesthetic of good form. Whether typed or written, the act of recording faithfully, carefully, is still sacred. But what of the forgotten scribes? The women, the laymen, the itinerants who copied in secret or scribbled in the margins of someone else's story. How do we uncover the hands that history tried to erase? History remembers the great writers, the theologians, the poets, the philosophers. But for every name etched into the spine of a book, there were dozens, hundreds, of anonymous scribes who preserved their words. They are rarely remembered. They left no monuments. Most didn't sign their work. Some weren't allowed to. Others dared not, fearing punishment, erasure, or irrelevance. But here and there in the margins, their voices whisper. This section traces those whispers. The overlooked scribes, especially women, lay people, outsiders, and accidental authors. The ones who lived not at the center of power but along its edges. Through them, we glimpse not just how knowledge was preserved, but who preserved it, quietly, against the grain. While monastic life was dominated by men, many medieval and early modern women were deeply involved in textual labor. In convents, nuns produced devotional texts, copied letters, and created illuminated manuscripts. Some convent scriptoria rivaled those of male monasteries in output and quality. Notably, Hildegard of Bingen dictated her visionary writings to female scribes. Herad of Landsberg, a 12th century abbess, oversaw the creation of the Hortus Deliciarum, a richly illustrated encyclopedia. Gutta, a 12th century scribe, inserted her own self-portrait in a manuscript, signing, "Gutta, a sinful woman, wrote and painted this book." Beyond convents, women served as family scribes, recording household accounts, copying prayers, or writing letters for illiterate relatives. In some towns, widows of scribes continued their husbands' businesses, quietly running copy shops in the shadow of cathedrals and courts. Their names rarely appeared in colophons, but their hands shaped the margins of memory. In royal courts and noble households, scribes often served as secretaries, stewards, or personal copyists. They wrote under orders, often without attribution. Their work ranged from poetry to tax ledgers. In many cases, they were enslaved, indentured, or of low status, valued for their literacy, but denied the recognition granted to authors. In Islamic Spain, enslaved scribes were trained in calligraphy to serve wealthy households. In Renaissance Italy, young boys were apprenticed into copyist guilds, taught to emulate others' hands with no promise of original work. These scribes left behind not their names, but styles. Handwriting scholars can sometimes track a single anonymous scribe across decades and cities, recognizing their peculiar S or the way they dotted their I's. We know them only by their habits. They are, in a sense, the ghosts of the archive. Ironically, the most vivid scribe voices survive not in the body of the text, but in its margins. Their scribes complained, joked, grieved, and played. Common notes include: the ink is thin, the parchment is rough, the weather is cold. I am very tired. Thank you, Lord, this work is finished. Some doodled in the corners, faces, animals, dancing figures. Others commented on the text itself, correcting an author, questioning a translation, or nodding a missing line. In one Irish manuscript, a scribe wrote, "Write with care, or the cat will knock over the ink again." In another, "The plague is bad in the city. I do not know if I will finish this." These weren't just notes. They were lifelines, fragments of real lives pressed into the same parchment that carried kings, decrees, and saints' prayers. They remind us that books were made by people, not machines, not institutions, but individuals with sore backs, runny noses, and small hopes. Not all scribes copied for the church or university. Some worked in secret. In the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, scribes copied forbidden texts, Protestant treatises in Catholic lands, banned heresies, revolutionary pamphlets, or vernacular Bibles. These scribes risked prison, torture, or execution. Yet they wrote by candlelight, hiding pages in false walls or binding them inside innocuous covers. In Russia, under Tsarist censorship, samizdat, hand-copied illegal literature, kept banned ideas alive. In the Islamic world, forbidden mystic texts circulated in manuscript form centuries after being banned. These scribes weren't just copyists, they were resistors. They turned ink into rebellion. They copied not to preserve the past, but to protect the future. Even after printing became dominant, scribal cultures endured in surprising places. In Ethiopia, hand-copied manuscripts remained common into the 20th century, used in churches, villages, and oral traditions. In India, palm leaf manuscripts were copied and recopied for generations. In Jewish communities across the world, Torah scrolls are still copied by hand, letter by trained scribes sofrim, preserving both sacred text and ancient craftsmanship. In Tibetan Buddhism, sacred texts were copied as devotional acts, sometimes by pilgrims or monks with no formal training. Each imperfect stroke was still considered holy. Today, calligraphy, archival transcription, and even digital scribing continue the lineage, not because we need them, but because we remember what it means to write carefully, slowly, intentionally. The scribe never truly disappeared. They just moved behind the curtain. Final reflection: the patience that preserved us. In a world of noise and haste, the scribes remind us of something different, the power of silence, of slowness, of care. They didn't always choose their labor. It was often dull, tiring, or thankless. But without them, we would know almost nothing of who we were. No Homer, no Augustine, no Aristotle, no laws, no ledgers, no love letters. They preserved us, line by line. And perhaps the next time you write something by hand, a note, a journal entry, even a name, you'll think of them. Bent over vellum, ink on fingers, candle guttering in the wind. A small, forgotten hand, saving the world. The medieval world was cold, not just seasonally, but structurally. Windows were drafty, roofs leaked. Fireplaces, where they existed, struggled to heat more than a few feet in any direction. And so, survival wasn't just about food or shelter, it was about clothing. Enter wool. Coarse or fine, natural or dyed, heavy or light, wool was everywhere. It was worn by peasants and nobles alike. It was the dominant material in everything from underclothes to cloaks, blankets to bags. In many ways, wool was the fabric of Europe, and dressing in it was both a matter of survival and social identity. This story explores how people dressed for warmth, the rhythms of seasonal wardrobe changes, and why the long nightshirt, often mocked in modern depictions, was a genuine innovation in medieval comfort. Medieval Europe lived under the shadow of the Little Ice Age, a period from roughly the 14th to 19th centuries when average temperatures were significantly lower than today. This wasn't a single deep freeze, but a long era of colder winters, late frosts, and shortened growing seasons. It affected harvests, migration, architecture, and crucially, clothing. Homes lacked insulation. Glass was rare and thin. Doors often warped in their frames. In villages, entire families might huddle together on a single bed platform for warmth. People didn't dress for style. They dressed for thermal survival. And in that battle, wool was the front line. Sheep were easy to raise on poor soil and rugged hillsides. Their fleece was harvested annually, washed, carded, spun into yarn, and woven into fabric. Every village had its own spinners, weavers, and dyers. Every home had wool in some form. Wool could be thick and coarse for outer garments, light and loosely woven for summer, felted for water resistance, dyed using natural plants or minerals. Undyed wool was often brown, gray, or off-white. Bright colors, like reds, blues, or greens, signified wealth, as the dyes were expensive and unstable. A single wool tunic might take weeks to make. A full cloak could require the wool of multiple sheep. And yet people wore the same clothes for months, layering, patching, and adapting them year after year. Unlike modern fashion, where a single coat might suffice, medieval dress was built in layers, each with a role. A typical winter outfit for a working peasant might include a linen shirt if affordable, a woolen tunic or two worn over each other, wool hose tied to a belt or laced at the knee, a cloak fastened with a brooch or simple pin, a hood or coif to cover the head and neck, and woolen mittens or wraps for the hands. Footwear was basic, leather shoes or boots, sometimes stuffed with straw or cloth for warmth. Underneath it all, the body rarely bathed during winter. Clothes were a second skin, worn day and night. Shifting them meant losing heat, so people kept them on even when sleeping. Which brings us to an often mocked item, the nightshirt. Popular depictions of medieval people in floppy caps and nightgowns tend to elicit amusement. But the long woolen nightshirt, or shift, was a real and essential garment. Its purposes were many. It protected outer clothes from body oils and sweat. It could be easily washed, unlike heavier garments. It offered a thin but constant warmth close to the skin. And for women, it served as both sleepwear and underdress. In cold seasons, people often slept in multiple layers. Those with means might have feather mattresses and wool blankets, but many relied solely on clothing and shared body heat. Some even slept in hats, knit or felted, because heads lose heat quickly. The nightshirt was not just sleepwear, it was survival gear. And when infested with lice or soaked with sweat, it was boiled, again and again. Despite its dominance, wool wasn't one size fits all. People adapted it seasonally. In summer, lighter weaves were worn, often unlined. Tunics might be shortened or sleeves rolled up. Hoods were removed or replaced with wide straw hats. In winter, people added linings of fur or sheepskin. Cloaks grew heavier and longer. Gloves, caps, and foot wraps were reinforced. There was no such thing as a full wardrobe. Most peasants owned only one or two tunics, perhaps one for work and one for church. These were maintained carefully, patched often, and passed down when possible. Wealthier individuals had more, but even nobility respected wool's warmth. Kings wore fur-lined woolen robes and queens layered wool under silks. Silk might impress, but wool protected. Wool wasn't just a garment, it was a livelihood. Spinning and weaving were primarily women's work, especially among peasants. Girls learned to spin from an early age. The spinning wheel was a constant presence in homes and hearths. The phrase spinsters survives in English, not just as an outdated term for unmarried women, but as a reference to a real profession. Spinster households often supported themselves by selling yarn. In towns, wool guilds regulated quality. In regions like Flanders and England, the wool trade drove entire economies. Fleeces were graded, taxed, and exported. Wars were fought over it. Monarchs funded campaigns on the back of wool tariffs. It wasn't glamorous, but it was powerful. A rough cloak worn by a shepherd might represent a continent-wide economic web. And beneath it all, a scratchy nightshirt, always wool. But wool couldn't last forever. As trade expanded and new fabrics entered Europe, cotton, silk, and linen, how did the role of wool shift? And what happened when fashion, climate, and class collided in the clothes people wore every day? Wool was once the undisputed king of the medieval wardrobe, but by the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, it found itself in competition. New fabrics, lighter, softer, brighter, began to spread through Europe, carried on trade winds and backed by royal coffers. Cotton, silk, and fine linen offered tantalizing alternatives to scratchy, thick wool. And slowly, what people wore began to say not only who they were, but who they wished they were. In this section, we examine how wool fell from fashion dominance, how it remained vital for the poor and working class, and how climate, politics, and economics wove themselves into the fabric of Europe's closets. Cotton had been known to the ancient world, but it was rare in Europe during most of the medieval period. It arrived in small quantities from the Islamic world, through Sicily, Moorish Spain, and later, via Venetian traders. At first, Europeans misunderstood it. Some writers described it as growing on sheep-like trees. Others assumed it was a form of wool. But its properties were undeniable. It was softer than wool. It could be dyed more vividly. It was lighter, perfect for summer. By the 14th century, cotton was being imported in greater quantities. By the 15th century, Indian cotton textiles, intricately patterned and brilliantly colored, began to reach elite markets. Europeans were fascinated. In Italy, cotton garments became popular among the upper classes for underlayers and fine summer wear. In France, the nobility began importing cotton underclothes. England lagged behind, but would soon catch up. Still, for most, cotton remained a luxury, and wool remained essential. If wool was Europe's armor, linen became its inner skin. Linen, woven from flax, had been present in Europe since antiquity, but its use expanded dramatically in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. It was easier to launder. less likely to harbor lice, ideal as a base layer under heavier outerwear. By 1500, a standard wardrobe for a person of means might include linen undergarments, chemises, shirts, drawers, wool outer garments, decorative elements in silk or fur. This layering wasn't just about comfort, it was about display. The visible edge of a clean linen cuff, the crisp front of a shirt, these were marks of refinement. Wool, by contrast, became increasingly invisible, hidden beneath silks or pressed into livery uniforms. In many ways, wool's greatest virtue, its durability, became its greatest liability. It didn't shimmer, it didn't drape, it didn't seduce. It just worked. And in a world increasingly obsessed with status, working wasn't fashionable. Yet even as the elite shifted toward finer textiles, wool remained the backbone of working-class dress. Peasants, artisans, servants, and laborers wore wool for a simple reason. It was all they could afford. It was warm, local, and reliable. In England, strict sumptuary laws were passed to regulate what people could wear based on social rank. These laws often banned commoners from wearing silk or fine cotton. But for many, such bans were irrelevant. Wool was all they had. Shepherds wore hooded cloaks of thick, undyed wool. Blacksmiths wrapped wool leggings around their legs. Midwives swaddled infants in wool blankets passed down through generations. And at night, across the continent, people still slipped into long woolen shifts, shared beds with wool-stuffed mattresses, and tucked in beneath woolen coverlets. Wool was no longer elite, but it was still everywhere. As textiles became more varied, they became more symbolic. Wool was not just a material, it was a class marker. To wear it openly in elite company was increasingly rare, unless it was part of a carefully tailored fashion statement. This shift was political. In England, the wool trade funded much of the crown's activities. Monarchs taxed wool exports, granted wool monopolies, and used wool wealth to finance wars and diplomacy. The famous phrase, "the wealth of England rides on the back of a sheep," was not poetic, it was literal. And yet, even as England grew rich on wool, its wealthiest citizens grew less inclined to wear it. The wool industry became something others worked in, not something you dressed in. In Flanders, weavers and carders formed guilds. In Florence, wool merchants grew rich while laborers starved. In Spain, the Mesta, a powerful association of sheep herders, clashed with farmers over grazing rights. Wool had gone from clothing the body to clothing the state. While fashion turned its back on wool, the climate had other ideas. The Little Ice Age deepened in the 17th century. Crops failed, rivers froze, frost fairs were held on the frozen Thames. And once again, people turned to wool. Even the upper classes wore wool-lined garments during cold winters. Gloves, hats, and stockings were thickened. Woolen bed curtains returned to noble bedrooms. Peasants and townsfolk layered more than ever, adding scarves, mitts, and patched cloaks. Hand-spun wool socks became treasured gifts. Wool might not be fashionable, but it remained essential. A silent, insulating companion against a freezing world. But as the Industrial Revolution approached and machines began spinning thread faster than any human hand, what became of wool? Did it survive the rise of mass production, or was it finally unraveled by progress itself? By the 18th and 19th centuries, wool had clothed Europe for over 1,000 years. It had warmed emperors and shepherds, lined royal capes and peasant cloaks, padded the feet of pilgrims and swaddled newborns. It was more than fabric, it was infrastructure. But with the rise of industrial machines and global empires, wool's reign began to unravel. Factories spun cotton by the mile, trade ships delivered silk from across the world, and synthetic materials were on the horizon. Wool would survive, but no longer as a daily essential. It would become a choice. This final section traces the industrial transformation of wool, the shift from necessity to nostalgia, and the lingering legacy of the long woolen nightshirt. The invention of the spinning jenny in 1764 by James Hargreaves marked a turning point. Soon came the water frame, the power loom, and the mechanized carding engine. Textile production moved from cottages and villages into factories, loud, vast, dangerous places powered by steam and labor. Wool, which had long been spun by hand, was now processed by machines that could do in a single day what a spinner might need weeks to complete. Cloth flooded the markets. This made wool cheaper, but also rougher, coarser, and standardized. The handcrafted texture of village cloth gave way to the uniformity of mill-made flannel and serge. And as cotton production rose, especially through the use of enslaved labor in the American South, it undercut wool in price, weight, and wearability. Cotton was easier to clean, softer against the skin, and cooler in hot climates. Suddenly, wool was no longer for everyone. It was old-fashioned. Still, wool found a new role in the age of industry, as a uniform. Factory workers wore cheap wool trousers and jackets. Soldiers donned wool coats dyed red, blue, or gray, colors that bled when wet and itched constantly. Railwaymen, chimney sweeps, miners all wore wool. The fabric's durability made it perfect for rough labor. It burned slowly. It held up against friction. It provided warmth in freezing workshops and outdoor shifts. But it wasn't glamorous. Wool became associated with toil, with poverty, with blue-collar endurance. The upper classes wore cotton lawns and silk cravats. The poor still wrapped themselves in patched wool cloaks and threadbare shawls. And as synthetic dyes improved, even the once precious colors of wool faded into the background of smoky gray cities. In bedrooms, too, wool began to disappear. With central heating slowly spreading through homes and more people able to afford regular washing, the wool nightshirt fell out of favor. Cotton replaced it. Linen re-emerged in summer. Flannel offered a halfway point, but even that was often blended with other fibers. Sleeping in layers was no longer necessary. People began sleeping in less. Nightgowns, undershirts, pajamas, eventually nothing at all. The long woolen nightshirt, once a quiet guardian against midnight frost, became a cartoonish image, a relic of a colder, slower time. Something Scrooge might wear, not a modern man. And so it faded, not all at once but gradually, folded away in cedar chests, forgotten in attic trunks. Not mourned, not remembered. Just no longer needed. Ironically, in the 20th century, wool made a comeback, not as a survival tool but as aesthetic choice. Wool suits became symbols of respectability. Wool blankets returned to luxury catalogs. Harris tweed, once the fabric of farmers, was adopted by scholars, diplomats, and fashion houses. Brands marketed wool for its heritage, its Britishness, its authenticity. But it was no longer universal. Wool was now expensive, a niche, a style. It had traveled full circle from necessity to neglect to nostalgia. Most people no longer knew how to spin it, clean it, or sew it. Few had worn it straight from a sheep. The scratch, the weight, the musty dampness after rain, all vanished behind marketing slogans and merino blends. Wool, once a living part of the everyday, had become a curated experience. Wool teaches us something simple, that history is often carried in things we no longer notice. We study battles in books but not blankets. We remember revolutions, not the clothes people wore while waiting them out. Yet wool was there in all of it. Wrapping bodies during winter sieges, soaking up sweat in harvest fields, draped over the dead, passed from mother to daughter, patch by patch. It endured, not because it was beautiful, but because it was necessary. And now, in an age of fast fashion and synthetic blends, that kind of necessity is rare. We can afford to forget what wool once meant. But sometimes, especially in cold places or quiet mornings, it finds its way back. a scratchy sweater, a thick blanket, a knit hat that smells faintly of lanolin. And for a moment, the long nightshirt lives again. So next time you pull on a wool scarf or feel that soft prickle on your wrist, ask yourself, what did warmth cost before electricity? And how many hands had to card, spin, and weave just to keep one person warm through the night? Imagine waiting for a letter, not for days but for months. You don't know if it will arrive. You don't know if the person who carried it is still alive. And when it comes, the wax is cracked, the ink is faded, and half the message might be missing. This was the reality of long-distance communication for most of human history. Before cell towers, satellites, or even the printing press, the world relied on a patchwork of riders, foot messengers, pigeon posts, and perilous post roads. And at every turn, letters were delayed, intercepted, or simply lost, devoured by weather, war, or time. Yet somehow, empires rose, treaties were signed, lovers connected, and news spread. Because against all odds, people wrote and hoped someone would carry those words to the right door. In this story, we trace how communication crawled across continents, who carried it, and why sending a message was often an act of faith as much as function. The dream of rapid messaging is ancient. The Persian Empire, around 500 BCE, built one of the first true postal systems. Known as the Royal Road, it stretched from Sardis to Susa, a distance of over 1,500 miles. Along this route, couriers stopped at way stations, changing horses, resting, and relaying messages. Herodotus famously claimed, "Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers." Centuries later, the Romans improved the model. Their cursus publicus, state post, allowed imperial messengers to travel nearly 50 miles per day, thanks to a vast network of paved roads, inns, and relay stations. But these systems weren't for the common citizen. They were for the state, reserved for military orders, tax documents, or reports to emperors. Everyone else relied on themselves. Merchants sent letters with travelers. Lovers gave messages to monks. Kings might entrust diplomatic correspondence to trusted courtiers or hired riders. In most cases, the message's arrival depended entirely on who carried it and why. With the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe's road networks crumbled. Communication became slower, riskier, and deeply localized. In medieval times, sending a letter from Paris to Florence might take weeks or months, depending on weather conditions, bandit activity, river crossings, or political borders and bribes required to pass them. Still, people persisted. Monasteries became centers of communication, copying and relaying messages between religious houses. The church maintained a fragile information network that was often faster than any secular state. Royal courts developed their own messengers, cloaked men on horseback bearing wax-sealed scrolls. They were often tracked, bribed, or killed by rival factions seeking intelligence. A single misrouted letter could change the course of a war, or cost someone their head. And yet most people still relied on whatever means they could. Asking a traveling merchant, a pilgrim, or even a stranger at an inn to deliver their folded piece of parchment. Trust was everything. There were no envelopes, no tracking numbers. Just hope. By the late Middle Ages, commerce drove the need for more reliable messaging. In cities like Venice, Bruges, and Nuremberg, merchant guilds developed their own internal post systems. Couriers carried invoices, contracts, and exchange rates, critical information that determined fortunes. One of the most famous families to organize postal delivery was the Thurn-und-Taxis dynasty, which ran an efficient private courier system for the Holy Roman Empire by the 16th century. They established postmasters, individuals stationed in towns who received, sorted, and redirected mail. Post roads were mapped, rates were fixed. The idea of a postal route began to take form. Still, delivery was inconsistent. Winter made some roads impassable, wars diverted routes, horses died, riders disappeared. Some towns had a post day only once every few weeks. People gathered to see if letters had arrived or vanished. And when they did arrive, the contents weren't always private. Many letters were read aloud in public or stored and copied by scribes. Secrecy was rare. A letter's authority lay not in its envelope, but in its seal. Wax seals, imprinted with rings or signets, served as signatures, proof of authenticity and tamper indicators. A broken seal meant a letter had been read. A false seal could mean forgery. Different colors of wax sometimes signified urgency or status. Black wax for death notices, red wax for royal correspondence, green wax for ecclesiastical messages. Seals were deeply personal and deeply political. In some cases, letters were delivered unsealed, with the writer relying on the carrier to fold it and seal it upon delivery. Letter locks, elaborate folds and slits, were used to keep documents secure. These could be difficult to open without tearing. And yet, even with seals and locks, few messages were truly private. Postmasters might read them. Rulers often had spies intercept and transcribe letters. The letter was a gift of words and a gamble. Not all letters carried matters of state. Many carried something far more fragile, affection. Lovers wrote across long distances, their messages filled with poetry, longing, and encoded references. Parents wrote to sons at universities. Wives sent prayers to husbands on pilgrimage. And sometimes nothing came back. We have entire archives of one-sided correspondence, letters saved by recipients, while the responses are lost to time. A noblewoman writing to her imprisoned husband, a scholar pleading for funding, a mother begging for news. These are ghosts of conversation, sentences that hang in the air, unanswered forever. Some writers sent duplicate letters along different routes, hoping one might arrive. Others included coded messages or hidden notes written in lemon juice to avoid censorship. Still others simply gave up, burning letters rather than risk them falling into the wrong hands. Communication was never guaranteed, but people wrote anyway, because silence was worse. But what changed when national governments took over postal delivery, when stamps, schedules, and surveillance became the norm? How did this new system reshape the world's pace, and what did we gain or lose by learning to expect replies? By the 17th century, the random, trust-based world of personal letter carrying was giving way to something new: infrastructure. No longer just the domain of emperors, merchants, and monasteries, communication was being slowly standardized, claimed by nations, funded by taxes, and reshaped by bureaucracy. This was the rise of state postal systems. Letter delivery transformed from a favor or informal favor into a public service, though public often meant the privileged few. This chapter explores how governments institutionalized mail, the unexpected ways postal networks grew, and how writing a letter slowly shifted from an act of faith to a calculated expectation. In the early modern period, monarchs across Europe began absorbing private courier networks into state-run services. Why? Because information was power. Controlling who sent what and who received it meant controlling diplomacy, dissent, and debt. In England, Henry VIII created the Royal Mail in 1516, though it initially only served official court correspondence. By the early 1600s, under James I, the service began offering limited access to the public for a fee. France, Spain, the Habsburgs, and the Papal States all developed versions of this model, nationalized delivery systems, using fixed post stations, horses, and vetted carriers. But access remained narrow, literacy was still rare, postage was expensive, and mail was subject to censorship at every level. The postmaster emerged as a powerful figure in every town. He, and it was almost always a he, handled incoming and outgoing mail, managed delivery riders, enforced pricing, and sometimes read or copied sensitive letters before sealing them again. Postmasters were part government, part business. They charged by the sheet of paper and distance traveled. Folded once equals one rate, folded twice, higher rate. There were no envelopes yet, just intricate folds sealed with wax. Many people reused letters to conserve cost. Some included a second letter written between the lines of the first, in tiny cramped handwriting. To avoid fraud, watermarks and postal marks were introduced. Mail was date-stamped and location-stamped, early versions of modern tracking. But service was far from perfect. Mail between Paris and Lyon might take a week in good weather, or vanish altogether. Letters from London to Edinburgh took a week by horse. If storms or wars closed roads, the delay was indefinite. And yet people began to expect delivery. It was no longer a miracle, it was becoming a system. As mail systems grew, so did government oversight. State-run mail was a dream for intelligence officers. It allowed rulers to monitor dissidents, intercept enemy plans, track merchants and money. In France, the infamous Cabinet Noir, Black Cabinet, was a secret post office room where trained readers opened, copied, and resealed private letters without detection. Even in democratic-leaning systems like the Dutch Republic, mail surveillance was common, especially during wartime. This surveillance extended beyond politics. Churches used mail networks to monitor heresy. Banks used them to follow debtors. The price of communication was no longer just postage, it was privacy. And yet, despite knowing their letters might be read, people kept writing, often more carefully, sometimes in code, occasionally in double meaning or metaphor. The pen was both a message and a mask. In the early modern world, a letter wasn't just a document, it was a tactile artifact. Paper was expensive, ink was homemade or imported, pens were cut from feathers or reeds, wax had to be softened over a flame. Many letters were cherished, tied with string, stored in boxes, kissed, cried over. The physicality mattered. The crease told you how it was folded. The smell told you where it had been stored. The handwriting revealed mood, urgency, or emotion. Letters bore witness to events: a merchant's trembling script during a famine, a soldier's report of cannon fire, a wife's lopsided lines after a long illness. These weren't just communications, they were moments preserved in paper. Even governments understood this. Royal decrees and state letters were often illuminated or embossed, with wax seals the size of medallions. Writing, even in government hands, retained a sense of ritual. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, postal networks expanded across Europe and into colonial territories. New postal roads were laid, rutted tracks lined with inns and relay stations. Coaches replaced lone riders. Stagecoaches carried both passengers and letters, jostling over mountain passes and muddy bridges. In cities, mail was picked up at coffeehouses, taverns, or civic buildings. In some places, post horns were blown upon arrival. In rural areas, post delivery could still mean giving a message to the village priest, innkeeper, or even a passing stranger with a trustworthy look. Still, the system worked, haltingly, imperfectly, but steadily. A net of ink and roads was cast over Europe. And for the first time, ordinary people began to experience what we now take for granted: the expectation of a reply. But what happened when letters crossed oceans, battled weather and war, and tried to connect colonies, empires, and families across the globe? What did it mean when distance became vast, and the waiting stretched into seasons, or even years? By the 18th and 19th centuries, postal networks had matured in Europe. Roads had been paved, postmasters installed, schedules published. But the world was expanding. Colonies stretched across continents. Ships sailed with goods and people to distant shores, and with them went letters, packets of ink and hope, wrapped in wax and time. But overseas mail was a different beast. It wasn't just slow. It was perilous, uncertain, and often final. Sending a letter to a son in India or a husband in New England was like whispering across a canyon. Hoping someone on the far side was still listening. This final section explores how global communication worked when mail meant months, risked storms and war, and arrived after its meaning had already changed. To send a letter across the ocean was to engage in logistical prayer. Mail between Europe and the Americas, Africa, or Asia was typically carried by merchant ships, naval vessels, or chartered postal packet boats. There was no fixed schedule. You handed your letter to a captain, a mate, or a ship's agent and trusted them. If the ship sank, your words went with it. If pirates boarded, the mail might be burned. If the crew fell ill, delivery could be delayed indefinitely. And yet families did it, merchants did it, colonial officials depended on it. Some ships carried locked mail bags, guarded by seals and government instructions. Others simply tied letters into bundles, passed from hand to hand. Many mail packets included copies of the same letter, written 2 or 3 times, sent on different ships to ensure at least one arrived. A voyage from London to Boston took 6-8 weeks in good weather. To India, 3-6 months. To Australia, often more than 200 days. By the time your letter arrived, the world had already changed. One consequence of long-distance mail was the normalization of delay. People wrote as though the recipient might be dead. They asked questions they knew might never be answered. They told stories in past tense, accepting that the moment had already passed. Letters became time capsules. A child's first steps. A marriage proposal. News of a war's end. A death notice. Sometimes the response was heartbreakingly mistimed. There are letters from immigrants begging their families to join them, arriving long after the family had died of plague. Letters from lovers proposing marriage, received by people who had already wed someone else. Business deals confirmed after the cargo had spoiled or been seized by customs. The postal system was global, but it was not fast. It preserved connection but did not guarantee relevance. Colonial powers quickly realized that mail wasn't just about intimacy, it was about authority. In India, the British East India Company established postal routes that doubled as intelligence networks. Riders on horseback carried both letters and reports. Forts became post stations. Scribes translated, copied, and archived everything. In West Africa and the Caribbean, mail routes served plantations and garrisons, connecting extractive economies to distant capitals. Colonial post was not open to all. In many places, indigenous people were denied access to formal mail systems. Their communications were deemed unworthy, dangerous, or simply irrelevant to the colonial enterprise. Meanwhile, censored and reed letters were common. Governors opened packages. Military commanders delayed dissenting mail. Missionaries used letters to report on local progress, shaping the narratives that funded their work back home. Mail was a tool, not just of connection but of control. Despite the barriers, letters also became lifelines. Enslaved Africans wrote letters, when allowed, through intermediaries, often dictated to literate clerks. The enslaved and formerly enslaved used letters to trace kin, request freedom papers, or beg for news. Indentured laborers wrote home to China, India, and Ireland, describing brutal conditions, asking for food, money, or simply prayers. In diasporic communities across the world, letters became sacred objects. Read aloud and wept over. Carried in pockets for years. Rewritten, recopied, memorized. Entire networks of letter writers emerged, professionals who wrote for the illiterate. They composed messages, folded them, sealed them, and sometimes even delivered replies. For many, writing was impossible, but being written for still meant being heard. Even in exile, the letter was a thread of identity. By the mid-19th century, mail systems began to modernize, powered by steamships, railways, and eventually the telegraph. Postage stamps were introduced, so were standardized rates, postal inspectors, and international mail agreements. The Universal Postal Union, founded in 1874, allowed countries to send and receive mail under a unified system. You could send a letter from Argentina to Prussia and expect delivery, eventually. Mail became more predictable, but something changed in spirit. Letters were now part of bureaucracy, not mystery, expected, timed, traced. The slowness that once made them sacred, every word chosen, every paragraph considered, began to fade. Still, the long, slow letter didn't vanish. It just became rarer, a choice, not a necessity. And when it came creased, smudged, perhaps still carrying the scent of the sender, it still mattered. Because some words don't need speed, they just need to arrive. In an age of instant messaging, we often forget what a letter once meant. It wasn't just communication, it was a ritual of presence. To send a letter was to say, "I am thinking of you, even if the world falls apart before you read this." It was slow, often too late, but it was real. The road was long, the ocean was vast, the weight was cruel. But the letter creased, warm from a stranger's hand, meant that someone somewhere had paused to think of you. And that's what made it precious.